Hello everyone, this is Ben, and in today's video what we're going to do is talk about various questions regarding demons and diseases. So, one of the, classic arguments against belief in the supernatural or just being religious in general is that in the old days, whether it was in Christian times, medieval Christianity, or earlier pagan times, people attributed diseases to the work of spirits or demons, or they might, if it was in pagan times, maybe they attributed it to fairies or elves or, hobgoblins or little water nymphs or like different gods or cohorts of gods and maybe a genie, like a whatever, and the argument is that now we're sort of beyond that. Now we're beyond that sort of supernatural, miraculous thinking, and we now know that if you catch cholera, it's because of waterborne bacteria, and that diseases don't work like that. That, if you get cancer, while handling a radioactive rock, it's not because the rock is cursed with like an evil spirit. You can handle the rock just fine with the proper shielding, and you just need to know what kinds of rock you can handle and what kinds you can't. It's just radiation from the rock. If you get skin cancer, you're in the sun too much, and there's this idea that we're sort of beyond that backward thinking. Now, the arguments against miracles and against the miraculous and against sort of supernatural activity in our natural world there's a bunch of them. People might argue and say that, there's no way Jonah could have been inside a whale for all that time, or a fish and survived. Or there's no way God floated the whole world. Or there's no way Jesus could have come back from the dead, or raised someone from the dead. Those miracles or supernatural actions are a little bit different from the question of demons being the source of diseases, or just the demonic being the source of diseases, or evil spirits, I guess, may be a better way of putting it. Because there is a theological problem with miracles, but it's not really a problem for the odd miracle here or there. So so for example, God, taking Jonah inside a fish to Nineveh, or Jesus coming back from the dead, or Elijah raising the widow's son, was it the widow of Nain? I can't remember. Or Elijah calling down fire on Mount Carmel. These particular miracles are kind of rare events, and they don't really cause the same sort of theological problem that you run into, and really an existential problem, really, that you run into if you had all diseases being explained by the work of evil spirits. That's a very different thing. So let me explain what I mean. Let's say that you want a hamburger, and so you go get in your car to go to the fast food restaurant to buy a hamburger, and about halfway there your car turns into an elephant. And then sometimes it does turn into an elephant, and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes other things happen. Sometimes, Superman shows up and laser beams the McDonald's to the ground with his laser eyes. In other words, the world has to have a certain degree of uniformity for you to live in it, for it to be something in which you can exist. It would be an existential problem if life was totally random. So if one night when you laid on the bed it felt soft and comfortable, and the other night it was sharp as knives, and you were laying on sharpened knives, and like when that happened and didn't happen was totally random, then life would be completely unpredictable and unlivable. And so this is an existential problem. Like it'd be if life was random and didn't function according to sort of regularities and uniform regularities, then it would be basically impossible to know how to live. You wouldn't know what choice to make. You couldn't exist, like, if you didn't have certain regularities. Like, so, for example, electricity is for a long time, people just saw electricity as this, like, crazy power of the gods. But once we began to understand how it works, it's like, okay, electricity is not only something we understand it so well that, like, there's such a high degree of predictability in how electricity works that we actually use it to do computations, to do calculations. So, like, predictability is key in knowing what choices to make, how to live life. Like, it's kind of a basic existential problem. It's no different with people. So, for example, credit companies have to have some way of predicting your behavior when it comes to paying your bills on time, or whether or not you're going to pay off your bills. And if humans didn't have just some sort of personality or character that generally determined how you live, then it would be impossible to loan people money. So for example, if it was just pure free will and like people just in the moment decided what they wanted to do, and it was just pure willpower, then like there would be no way to predict someone's actions. It's not pure willpower, is it? In reality, your character, your inherent character, generally is in the driver's seat. You have willpower, you have free will to make choices, but willpower is sort of a limited resource. You can't just, like, under your own willpower, just do whatever you want to do. You can use it to make changes here and there, but generally speaking, your overall personality is kind of how you live your life. And then you make changes here or there. And if it wasn't that way, then life would be unlivable. I mean, you couldn't hire someone to work for you because you wouldn't know if, that guy may be a really great worker one day and then suddenly all of a sudden not be. And if it was totally random, it would be a problem. Well, it's the same way with miracles. If the world was totally random, it would be a big problem. So for example, if I was to buy a tractor and had a hydraulic bucket on the front and the hydraulic bucket didn't work, then I would think, well, maybe there's a leak in the hose, maybe I didn't put fluid in it, or, maybe there's a part that's bent or crooked, or a pin somewhere is missing, or there's a safety switch I didn't hit, or maybe one of the valves, maybe the pump has failed, maybe a bearing went out, But if it was totally random, or if just like a demon just caused it just not to work, and there was just a demon in the tractor, then like, the problem that arises is it's like, well, how do I even live life like that? When just any time, anything can happen and it could just be like, well, it was just a demon. Then how do I know what to do? If life was really super random and stuff just didn't work all the time and I just had no idea and it could just be a demon, sort of magically causing it to happen, then it'd be pointless to even get in the driver's seat of the tractor and try to crank it up because you don't know what's going to happen, right? There has to be a certain degree of predictability in life for you to make plans, for you to have projects, goals, or anything that you intend to do. There has to be a certain amount of predictability. You put plants in the ground, you have some idea that, the seeds are going to germinate as long as certain conditions are met, and you're going to be able to have a crop next year. So, this is an existential problem. It's a basic fact of existence that life has to have a certain degree of uniformity for us to live in it, or for us to be able to exist. Okay, and people talk about it as though this is purely a scientific issue, that like, oh, well, science couldn't work if we didn't have uniform laws through which the world works, like the laws of, the electrical laws, like, voltage equals amperage times resistance, or I think, I can't remember that. Is that Kirchhoff's law or Ohm's law? I think it's Ohm's law. So like V equals IR, and then you've got relationships between energy and, basic electrical laws. the predictability and the uniformity of those laws is what is allowing computers to work at all. If those laws were more random, then we couldn't have computers. We couldn't have computation. We couldn't do calculation. And complex calculations are how you're listening to me right now. It's how you're seeing a picture on the screen. There's lots of complex calculations that are happening very quickly. And it's uniformity in how the world works that allows that to happen. Predictable uniformity. So it's essential for science, but it's actually just essential for life anyway. Even outside of science, like, if you were to think that, like, rocks may just all of a sudden decide to fall up instead of down, and gravity might just reverse randomly, then it'd be a very scary world and you wouldn't know how to exist in it. And you wouldn't know what to do. Okay? And basically, if you thought demons were magically causing these things to happen, then it would be pointless to understand how the world works. You would just want to understand how the demons work. Because that would be all that matters. Getting on their good side or dealing with them, maybe fighting with them, but like whatever you do with them, that would be all that mattered, right? So, anyway, I say this existential problem is also a theological problem. And the reason why is because if God created this world for us to live in, then there has to be some sort of way for us to make sense of it and live in it. So, given the Christian and biblical idea of a creator God, then the world has to function with some degree of uniformity. Okay? It's just a theological necessity based on basic concepts of theology that there's a creator God that intended for us to live and exist in this world. Then there has to be some sort of way for us to exist in it. Okay? So and really live. That being said, the odd miracle here or there is not really a problem. So, if God, carries Jonah inside a fish to Nineveh one time in all of human history, that doesn't really disrupt general uniformity. It would be an issue for that particular event, but it's not, the odd miracle here or there doesn't really make life, unlivable. So it's not really a big problem. It would be a big problem if things like that happened all the time and didn't happen all the time and it was totally random. Okay. It's a bit of a different issue when you get into the question of blaming demons for like all diseases, or even if you just blame demons for like most diseases or the lion's share of diseases, then that raises a serious theological problem, because again, it would be, God, like, how could you let this happen? Didn't you mean for us to exist in this world and to make sense of diseases? And if diseases are just completely, dealing with demons and that sort of thing, and it becomes totally random. Okay. And so that's a bit of an issue. All right. Now, before we delve into that, let's backtrack just a little bit and let's think about the questions of God performing miracles, because sometimes there's scientific objections that say that, like, well, God couldn't, any miracle that violates the laws of nature is automatically scientifically impossible, or really not impossible, but so improbable that like it would upset everything we've seen with science. So it's essentially scientifically disproven as much as science can go. So, like, for example, you've got any miracle you like. The thing about laws of nature and scientific laws in general is, especially if you go back to the older laws, that sort of the pre-quantum physics, pre-Einstein. Einstein and quantum physics aren't the same thing, but basically they come around the same time, around the turn of the century, which means from 1800s to 1900s. But if you go back before that, you're working in the sort of the Newtonian world, and Newtonian science of the 1800s and 1700s, and then sort of the pre-Newtonian stuff in the 1600s that built up to Newton, and in the 1500s too. The issue there is that in the Newtonian classical paradigm, what's called Newtonian physics, you've got various laws of science like force equals mass times acceleration. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So, for example, if you're on a sled on like a frictionless plane, then any effort if you try to push on the front of the sled, or like run forward and push the front of the sled, and you're standing on the sled, then your efforts to push the sled forward will also push it back, and you won't go anywhere. So, it can get a little more complicated than that. If you've got friction to sort of work with, you can move forward slowly, build up speed, and then hit the front of the sled going quickly, because friction was, creating resistance. That was a big rabbit trail there. But, here's the general gist of it. Here's an example that maybe it'll make sense. I'll give you a basic example. Years ago, I don't know how many times, every once in a while somebody comes up with the idea that they can make a lawnmower or a car run on water. I remember a young man who was he was a college student. I think he was like a senior in college. He was an economics major. He went on to grad in economics, and but he had gotten convinced somehow that he knew a guy who had a lawnmower that could run on water. And he was literally down the road, and I disagreed with him, and he was yelling at me, and he seemed to think that the fact that he was emotional about what he was saying, somehow made it correct, which is kind of sad. I mean, that's just sort of a sad. That's just sad, that's what you're gonna do. But anyway, here's the point. And this is the point I was trying to make to him. Water is H2O, right? It's hydrogen, two hydrogens, and an oxygen. Okay, oxygen has a negative charge and hydrogen has a positive charge. And those ions will want to bond together and form water. So if they're in the presence of one another, they're going to bond. Hydrogen is not going to stay hydrogen, and oxygen is not going to stay oxygen if they can make water. Okay, if there's enough, if there's no free hydrogen in the air, then there'll be pure oxygen in the air, but it has to have that. Otherwise we couldn't be breathing. But anyway, if you were to insert two electrical plates into water and charge one of them with a negative charge and charge the other one with a positive charge, then the negative charge plate, the electrically charged plate, would attract the hydrogen ions, and actually, with enough electrical energy, you would actually separate the chemical bond of H2O. So it would take a lot of electrical energy, but you could do that. You could separate the bond. And then you have hydrogen and oxygen separate. And they'll come out of the water. Okay. Well, hydrogen is actually combustible. So it will burn, and you can use it to run a basic combustion engine like in a lawnmower or a car. When it burns, it has to have oxygen to burn, just like any basic fire has to have oxygen to burn. But hydrogen will burn without a spark or anything. It just burns as soon as it's in the presence of oxygen. And the only byproduct it produces is water. In other words, that chemical bond that you separated is now going back. Okay? It just goes back. And then you get a lot of heat energy out of burning hydrogen. And it will just produce steam, water vapor, and it's clean burning. And so, hey, you've got a lawnmower that can run on water, right? All you've got to do is hook up the battery of the lawnmower to two electrical plates, separate out the hydrogen and the oxygen, and then it'll run and then burn it, and it's like the perpetual motion machine, right? Okay, so the idea that you could really run a combustion engine on that process violates the first and second law of thermodynamics. If I remember right, those are Newton's laws. So anyway, first law of thermodynamics, basically energy in must equal energy out. If you got all of it accounted for, then energy in equals energy out. So like the amount of energy that it takes to separate the hydrogen bond with the electrically charged plates will be exactly the same as the energy you get back out when you reform the same bond again. So, in other words, this lawnmower will just run until the battery's dead. It'll run, but once the battery dies, it's really just running off the battery, creating hydrogen, burning the same hydrogen, And then the second law of thermodynamics says there must always be an entropic increase. There must always be an increase in entropy. So like, or rather that reactions are, I can't remember the word, spontaneous, which means they happen if there's an entropic increase. So entropic increase is spontaneous. So like, which means it happens. So like, what that means, for there to be an increase in entropy, it means that like the original state you had H2O molecules, and then you go through the electricity and the burning, and then out the tailpipe goes H2O molecules again. According to the second law of thermodynamics, there is no way that there won't be an increase, basically, to put it roughly, in randomness. So for example, if you were to take ping pong balls and stack them into perfectly on top of one another in a very organized way inside of a box, and then say you were to take that box and pour it into another box of the same size, they would not be perfectly on top of one another. There would be an entropic increase, an increase in randomness. So like, in other words, not all of the hydrogen and oxygen molecules that you separated are gonna find their way back to each other. In other words, according to the second law of thermodynamics, you're not going to get as much energy out as you put in to that system. So I say all of that to kind of get us in the mindset of thinking about scientific laws, physics, thermodynamics, okay? The second law of thermodynamics, for example, is only true for a closed system. So one of the arguments people make, a lot of times actually, I think it's young Earth creationists make, is that the existence of life on Earth represents an entropic decrease, because living cells in plants and animals and people are incredibly organized. And, they're, in other words, like how are living cells even formed? Well, energy is taken in from the sun, water and CO2 are taken in by plants, forming sugar molecules and basic building block proteins of all this stuff. That's a solar-powered reaction, and then animals eat plants, and then other animals eat plants and eat those animals and get that stuff in them, to energize an increase in organization and a decrease in randomness. It's highly organized. Well, the thing is, it isn't actually a violation of the second law of thermodynamics, because the second law of thermodynamics states that there must be an entropic increase if you account for everything within the closed system, within the whole system or the closed system. So for example, yes, there's pockets of entropic decrease, like the existence of your body, but in the overall scheme of things, the randomness of radiation from the sun and all the different things that are going on within the solar system, and the even cosmic rays that we're being bombarded with, like it's actually a huge increase in entropy. It's nowhere near. It's not an entropic decrease at all. So it's only true for a closed system. that closed system caveat is actually true for any law of Newtonian physics. That like this is all things being equal unless something new enters into the system from the outside. So for example, if you've got a car on a ramp, the amount of and the car weighs a certain amount, and it's on Earth, so gravity is a certain amount, and the car rolls with a certain degree of friction, or maybe it's a sled, then it's going to take it. Then that car will take a certain amount of force to push up that ramp, and it will apply a certain amount of force to that ramp, and you can calculate all of that for a closed system. But if a rock falls off of a mountain and hits the car and comes in from outside of the system, then that will upset all of the equations, because now you've got new matter and energy that's being input from outside of the system. Okay, so when it comes to Newtonian physics and miracles, the thing is, like, what if the universe overall is not a closed system? What if God, being God, could just enter in new oxygen for Jonah to breathe in the belly of the fish? That isn't technically a violation of the laws of physics. The laws of physics have no problem with that, because the question of whether or not the universe overall is a closed system isn't really a scientific question. That's a question of metaphysics. It's a philosophical question. Some people prefer to think it is a closed system. Some people prefer to think it isn't. But specifically, strictly speaking, science can only study the universe itself. So, so anyway, let's see. That being said, there's no reason it couldn't happen. I guess that's the best way to put it. There's no reason it couldn't happen. Now, on top of that, we've got other issues regarding quantum physics, which is the much more difficult to understand current paradigm of physics. And let's see if I can explain this. The buckyball experiment is the classic, or the two-slit experiment is the two-slit buckyball experiment is the classic way to explain this. And I'm no expert, but like I think I understand it well enough to explain it. So here we go. If you were to take a soccer player who kicks soccer balls for a living, and you were to put him in front of like a wall with two doors in it, and then behind that wall was another wall, and you were to tell him just to kick soccer balls randomly at the wall, then what he would do where would you expect most of the soccer balls would just hit the first wall that had the two doors in it. Some of the soccer balls would go through the doors and hit the wall behind it. So where would you expect the balls to hit the wall? You would expect them to hit, predominantly, most of them that went through the first wall would be directly piling up on the, behind there. In other words, directly up in front, behind the doors, would be most of the balls that got through the doors would be directly behind the doors. Some of them would kind of go through at an angle, but there would be less of those. And that's true if you do that experiment, okay? But if you do the same experiment with quantum objects, in other words, like molecules or like atoms, and you shoot atoms at a wall with the two slits and another wall behind it, they don't pile up like that. They pile up with a sort of what's called an interference pattern, as though they're taking every possible route that there is in the universe from point A to point B. And where they interfere with one another, there's less of them. So they're going, in other words, they don't just go from A to B, they go everywhere. And where they wind up has more to do with where they interfere with one another where their paths are crossing. So it gets kind of weird. And so in quantum physics, the location of a quantum particle, like a molecule or an atom, is not any specific location. It's a probability distribution. So, like, if there was a molecule sitting on the table in front of you, then its location is not really on the table in front of you. The location of that molecule is a probability distribution. That's its most probable location, but actually there's a non-zero. So, for example, let's say you're sitting inside your car, then it's incredibly likely that the location of all the quantum particles that form your body are inside your car. But there is a non-zero probability, not zero, minimal, very low, but still not zero, that all of the particles in your body are actually on the outside of the door, and you're falling on the road and rolling into the other lane of traffic. It's incredibly unlikely, but it's not impossible. So the location of any quantum object is given a probability distribution. So then it becomes this question of like, okay, Jesus turned the water into wine. Well, like, there could be wine molecules on the other side of the universe, and there's a non-zero probability, and it's incredibly unlikely, but nonetheless a non-zero probability that all of those wine molecules would wind up in that glass. You know? So anyway, all of that being said, I just wanted to point out that like there's not really a conflict between biblical miracles per se and science and the laws of science. But there is a theological or an existential and therefore theological problem with miracles. But there's not really a problem with the odd miracle here or there. Okay? So the objection to miracles is not really scientific. It is sort of philosophical. Sort of a combination of existential philosophy with theology, which is another branch of philosophy. So that earlier problem is the real problem. This issue of contradicting laws of science isn't really a problem. Okay? So, again, like we said, it's still not a problem with the odd miracle here or there. But it does become a problem when you blame just all diseases, or even half of diseases, or just many diseases on demons. It becomes a problem, like if the diseases that plague your tractor were just blamed on demons kind of randomly like that, then it would be kind of hard to do any work with your tractor. Anytime something went wrong, you'd be like, maybe it was the demons, This is one of the problems with people, sometimes argue nonsensically. It tends to be something that they say only in... So there's an argument for God's existence that says that the universe began to exist. Everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Therefore, the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. And then it goes further to argue in other ways that the only cause of the universe could be God. And people, sometimes, there's a bunch of responses people make to that. It's a classical proof for God's existence. There's a bunch of responses people make. One of those responses is that maybe things can just pop into existence without a cause. And see, that would be the same problem I'm talking about. That would be an existential problem. That would be even worse than demons, blaming demons for diseases. Because now you've just got nothing. Like you could just, turn into a pink Cadillac right now. And why did that happen? For no reason at all. It happened because nothing happened. Without a cause. And so let's say you're playing poker and one guy wins every hand, and you say, there's no way you won every hand without cheating. That's incredibly unlikely. It's like, no, you can't establish likelihood on any event, because sometimes things could happen for no reason at all, and you can't even say how often they happen for no reason at all. Anything can happen at any time for no reason at all, and there's no way to even establish probability. So if you come home and find all of your stuff missing and the door broken in, the cops could say there's no point in going and looking for who took your stuff, because it could all be gone for no reason at all, and there's no way to even establish how often that happens or how likely that is to happen. Okay. So anyway, that being said, blaming demons for all or even many diseases isn't as bad as saying that things happen for no reason at all. But it's still a serious theology problem. And the reason why I want to make this video is because the demonic disease connection is not only something that's traditional in Judaism and in Christianity, but they actually went to the point. The Jews in Jesus' day and in the centuries before, and probably in the Christians after, and probably in the New Testament, and this is something I get from Michael Heiser's book Demons, what the Bible really says about evil spiritual force. I forget the exact title. He's a scholar on these matters. Is that it was the general view in that context that the demonic was not to be blamed for every disease, but was mainly to be blamed for disease. Like in general, that was the main explanation for why we have disease. It was the work of evil spirits. And it's more complicated with the differences between evil spirits and demons and angels and sons of God, and we're not going to go into that stuff. But we can just sum it up with demons for our purposes for this video. And it's essentially okay. It makes a mockery. It makes at least medicine sort of an existential problem. It's like, how do we do medicine if it's so random like this, and it becomes a matter of like dealing with demons, and we have no idea how we're dealing with demons, and there's no regularity and uniformity to it, and it leads to like superstition, like, oh, you went to a house that was haunted, and so that's why you got sick, and that kind of thing. There's a foul spirit in that place, and people just randomly try to create rules of uniformity to how the demons are, infecting us all, but really they don't know, and they're just making stuff up, and then it's just trying to create regularity out of something that's irregular. Winds up, hey, why did I get sick? Well, that woman who lives down the road is a witch. Let's tie her up and burn her, and so this kind of thing, So that's what I want to talk about. It is apparently an important view here. Well, it's and we see a lot of it, examples of it with Jesus healing people of diseases, and in many situations there's absolutely a connection between Jesus healing someone of a disease and a demon or an evil spirit. So now it's important for me to point out that they did have a belief in those days that there were diseases that didn't have anything to do with the evil spirits. Especially fevers. They thought fevers were not demonic. They didn't think fevers were demonic. But other things like if someone was mute, or someone had when someone has mental issues and they go insane. I remember one time this fella told me the story about his wife, and she had this like mental problem. She was going insane. It literally sounded like demon possession. But people can seem kind of demonic when they have mental problems, even if they're just bipolar, which is treatable with chemicals. Can largely help. Sometimes our chemical treatments don't help as much as we'd like, but in some cases they do. So anyway, hopefully I've set up the problem and I've negated the non-problems that we don't need to worry about so that we can focus on the real issue. Is it a problem for demons being probably biblically blamed for all or really for many diseases? No, not really. You say, well, Ben, why is that? It seems like you just got through explaining why it is a problem, and now you're going to tell us that it's not. Well, it's not really a problem in the case of diseases because diseases can go, pardon the pun, viral. In other words, they can have a life of their own that functions according to regularities, and so a demon really only has to create the disease, and then it can have a life of its own, a life all of its own. you know, so yeah, just like we create diseases in the labs, and people are talking about that a lot these days. I'm making this video in February 2021. That particular question is in the news right now. I'm not going to go into that, but it's a thing. If we can do it, demons can do it, and then they can have a life all of their own. Now, there seems to be specific examples where Jesus performs an exorcism that's associated with the healing of a disease. Well, specific examples like that are less of an issue. What really is an issue is that in the general context of Jews in Jesus' day and in Christians following Jesus' day, that they thought that demons were largely responsible for diseases in this world. But it's a little more specific than that. They believe that in the days of Noah, evil, rebellious sons of God led the world into greater evil, and they introduced disease, or a lot of disease, into the world. That they are to be blamed. So, in their view, it was a specific event of the past. So, that being said, hopefully that, answers the basic question. There's a little something else we need to say about this, or maybe a couple of things. One long thing and one short thing. One long thing is a different question of what about demon possession, where a person is possessed by a demon, then the demon's supernatural activity is causing all of the actions of that person, which would seem like miracles every time. And then you've got an additional question of what about human free will anyway, where all of your choices? That's an important question, and I already made a long video about it. So I'm just going to say, look back at my recent videos and you should see something about free will there. And, human consciousness and that sort of thing. That's a different question. But there's one more interesting point to make about this. Now that we've kind of set this up. Jesus comes, and one of the things that he does is he heals diseases. That is a major trend with Jesus. That is a big part of Jesus' ministry. Healing diseases. Jesus heals. Jesus heals diseases. He's constantly healing diseases. He's also declaring his authority and putting his foot down against the demonic. There's a lot of things that Jesus does. Jesus seems to uproot the skewed moral views of the Jews of his day and turn them on their head. And he also introduces himself in belief in him as the most important thing you can do with your life and that sort of thing. So but one of the major things that Jesus comes to do is heal diseases. And he does it miraculously. Just with a word, he just casts demons out. It's okay. What about maybe that was a precursor? We tend to think of it as Jesus healed diseases, and then when he was gone, Christians didn't have miraculous power to heal diseases like that anymore, or they did with the apostles, but it went away, and what happened to it? Well, maybe it's possible that God, and this is getting fairly speculative here, but not entirely speculative. But here's my semi-speculative speculation, which makes no sense. It's possible that God had Jesus and the apostles healing diseases as a precursor to the more general healing of diseases that was to come through modern science. And a supporting piece of evidence for this is the fact that Christianity created modern science. And so we have the religion of following Jesus Christ to thank for the curing of a lot of diseases, for the understanding of how they work and giving us power over diseases. Not in this sort of with a word way, but nonetheless, that could have been a sign or a precursor. Not exactly what God intended to do, but a sign for what was to come. Okay? Now you may say to me, Ben, well, a big part of what you're saying relies on the question of whether or not Christianity created science. And I would respond to you with, yes. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about that as briefly as we can. I think we can do it fairly briefly. So, Christianity created science. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 alternative views, and then we'll take a look at Christianity creating science. And so we'll take a look at these 5 other views. Really the only other views you ever hear. I don't ever heard, unless you want to say that mole men from the center of the earth created science. I mean, there are people who say that aliens created science and gave it to us, but, or maybe like in Terminator, where they like time travel back from the future, and then we used the microchip technology to create modern microchips, time loop. Okay, I'm not going to discuss that. So we're going to discuss more serious views. So one view is that that science was never invented or created. It just always existed, and it's just common sense. And so this view argues that that the scientific method is something that even Stone Age people used. So what they would say is something like this. Okay, here's a woman, she's picking berries, and she can only pick so many berries in her hands, and then her hands are tied up holding the berries, and this is annoying, and maybe she can set them on the ground, but it'd be a lot more convenient if she was to make a basket. She was to take some grass, some dry, thick, strong grass, weave it together into a basket, and then she can hold lots of berries in her basket. And so what they would say is that she's essentially doing all of the scientific method there. Okay, so what they would say is like she's theorizing, she's coming up with a theory that like, hey, I think if I weave this grass together into like this basket shape, it'll hold more berries. And so then she experiments and she makes her observation by actually attempting to make it and using it, and then she sees that it works. And so there's been a progress in science. And so science is something that humans have just always done. Now, that particular view is it's just plain wrong, and it really ignores the contribution that the ancient Greeks made to science. And so if you want to say who created science, you have to say the ancient Greeks and Christianity created science. So it was Greece and Christianity. The Greeks added in a key step that had always been missing all the way up until their time. So like everything, what that woman's doing, you could call it engineering, you could call it craft work, you could call it technique, you could call it technology, you could call it skill, but you can't call it science because it lacks theorizing. It has theorizing in the sort of general sense of the word that most people use the word, which is like just a guess about something. But in science, a theory is bigger than just a guess. For a theory is a big idea about how things work in a grand explanatory way. And there's a really famous scientist who explained this point with a really good example, and so it like sticks in my head. I'm like, I gotta remember this point. And it's a scientist by the name of Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin said, this is what he said, those people who think the Stone Age had science, this is what he would say to them. He would say, if that's the case, then what a geologist should do is just sit in a ditch and count all the red rocks and the white rocks. And what he went on to say is that you have to understand that in science, all observation must be for or against a particular view of things. So then it has some sort of predictive nature. So for example, even in the Bronze Age, they knew how to make, that if you measure four equal units this way and 3 equal units this way, and then you make it 5 between those two ends, that'll be like a 90-degree angle. They learned a lot about the world. The Egyptians figured out how to build these big pyramids, But they weren't doing science because they weren't coming up with general theories about how the world works. Whereas the Greeks did do that. So, the Greeks had big general physical theories of, laws of physics kind of thing. Not really laws, basically general explanations for things. So, you would say, well, all right, Ben, then the Greeks created science. The classical Greeks, 500 BC-ish. Not exactly. Like I said, they did the first part. The Greeks never did the second part. They refused to test their theories with observations. It wasn't as though the idea never occurred to them, and that's going to become something important that we're going to talk about later on. But the idea occurred to them. They're like, hey, we came up with a theory, let's go make an observation to test it. But the Greeks believed that pure logical reasoning was the proper way to test a theory. And that if you tested a theory with an observational experiment, then your way of proving your theory was not as good and unsound. And that was generally a no-no and something to be ashamed of in your scientific work. So, the Greeks believed that, it should just be pure logical reasoning in your head. And that was the better form of science. So, for example, Aristotle's physics came to dominate the thought from his time all the way up until the Middle Ages, and when the Christians created science. And even in Christianity, there was one side that didn't want to embrace the scientific method. They called the experimental method in those days. In the Middle Ages, around the 1200s, the debate is raging. And then you had the other side that was fighting for it. In the Greek world, the idea of experimental observation existed, but nobody thought it was a good thing. Everybody thought it was a bad thing. They sometimes you would do it and you would be ashamed of it. So let's just jump forward a little bit to kind of help explain this. Muslims, sometimes you have people who try to trick you basically and say that Muslims created science. And what they do is they show you an example of a particular Muslim scientist who actually did the scientific method and theorized and tested the observations with an experiment and recorded data like that. What they don't tell you when they make that argument is that Muslims got their ideas from the Greeks, and they too were ashamed of doing that. So the idea of experiment and observation had always been something that the Greeks knew about, but they considered it shameful. And there were some Muslims who did that, but again, it was when they just didn't know. It was when they couldn't come up with a way to just think about it logically, and so that was seen as sort of a half measure and sort of a no-no. But what was unique about the Christians is that they actually argued for it as a good thing. That was the unique Christian input. So for example, here's an example with the Greeks. Aristotle's physics argued that a rock that is heavier will fall to the ground faster than a rock that is lighter in weight. In reality, acceleration due to gravity is constant. A heavy rock and a light rock will hit the ground at the same time. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but the driving factor is the gravitational force from the Earth, which is the same size regardless of how big the rock is. The rock's particular gravitational force is actually slightly different, but it's an incredibly irrelevant difference. Whereas Aristotle said that a lightweight rock will fall to the ground proportional to its weight. So a rock that's twice as heavy will fall to the ground twice as fast. Well, Greece is full of mountains and cliffs. He could have gone anywhere and tested this. And other Greeks could have gone and tested this. But they didn't. And why didn't they do it? Because they had all this logical reasoning that said that was that was wrong, So let's see, how do we put this? The Greeks so Aristotle started with a premise that nature abhors a vacuum. Okay? Where he got that premise is not so important. He probably observed it. Because he thought that ideas began with observation, but you had to test them with reasoning. So he said, whereas Socrates, his teacher, said that ideas begin purely in the mind, Aristotle said that ideas begin with observation. But then Aristotle went on to say that once you observe them, then they are just, you have to test them in the mind. That's the correct way to work with them. So he wasn't all that different from Socrates, but somewhat different. So Aristotle, said that a rock that's twice as heavy falls to the ground twice as fast. Because he started with the idea that, nature abhors a vacuum. So therefore, any object that ever moves must be overcoming friction. Because it's going through some sort of stuff, a gas. They even speculated that the planets and the heavenly bodies and the stars in the heavens and the sun and the moon move through some sort of substance they called the ether. Okay? And so they theorized that for something to overcome a resistance to its motion, it has to have some sort of what Aristotle would have called an efficient cause. So he said that he would disagree with Newton. Newton said that an object that is in motion tends to stay in motion. Has this thing called momentum. Aristotelian physics and Aristotle and all of the Greeks said the same thing, that no, an object that is in motion is always overcoming a resistance, and so for an object to stay in motion, there has to be some sort of pusher. So they believed in the ancient Greek world that different gods pushed the stars and the planets and the sun and the moon through the sky. And when you move on to Christian times, they retained the idea, they just turned them into angels pushing them through the sky. Or they, in Greek times, they might even said that the sun and the moon are living beings. So for the thing to actually be able to move, it has to be alive. It's moving because it's choosing to move. Okay? And so then Aristotle would say that heavy rocks fall to the center of the earth twice as fast, because that's why they weigh twice as much, because they love the center of the earth, which in his day they believed was the center of the universe, twice as much. Okay? Now the interesting thing is that never in all of ancient Greek science did anyone ever just say, hey, let's go test that with an observational experiment. And it wasn't because the idea of experiment didn't exist. It existed. They did it sometimes, and they were ashamed of it when they did. That was seen as a no-no. Partially because they thought that nothing in this world really is a perfect representation of. It's always flawed in some way. Basically, the idea is like, in your mind, you can imagine a perfect circle, but you can never physically draw an absolutely perfect circle. It's something you can only represent like mathematically with like concepts. It only exists as a concept. So like the Greeks had this idea that everything in this world is sort of a flawed representation of the perfect, which is something that Socrates believed that like with your mind, you're directly accessing the world of forms, of Platonic forms, where the perfect thingy exists. Aristotle didn't believe in the world of forms, but this idea that everything in this world was flawed was certainly part of it. And the bottom line is, historically speaking, they just never tested, the Greeks and Romans never tested this theory. Now you fast forward to the Muslims, and you've got Muslims that like, let's see, there's one that they bring up all the time. I think his name's Al-Ghazali. Let's see if we can, I bet if I type in the name Al-Ghazali, it's going to say that he invented science. Yes. Alright. No, I think I'm thinking of the wrong guy. Let's see. Muslims created... It's a different Al. Science. Let's see. Oh, man. He did something with optics. I can't remember. They bring him up all the time. Ibn al-Haytham. That's his... So... While they made contributions to scientific knowledge, they didn't really, and they even used the scientific method. The important point here is that they continued the Greek idea of thinking that was the bad way to do science. That was the sort of the stopgap, something to be ashamed of. In the Muslim world, you had a double problem of like. Eventually, they came to believe that science, or specifically laws of nature, inhibit God's ability to act. And basically, they wanted to attribute everything to God's action, and so they ended up abandoning science. So eventually, they raised theological objections to science. But before that, I mean. They didn't, although they made all kinds of, basically they took the Greek ideas and kept running with them and pushed them forward. But they never broke out of that Greek mold. There was a counter movement. So like there was eventually the idea arose, I think it was Al-Ghazali who he was the guy who argued that science is just terrible and there can be no laws of nature because everything is attributed to Allah's freedom to act. It's sort of an anti-scientific attitude. And that eventually became the prevailing attitude. But there was another Muslim named Averroes who, like, at the same time rejected Al-Ghazali's ideas. And so there was a strong movement, pro-science movement under Averroes. But eventually Al-Ghazali's anti-scientific idea prevailed. The thing about Averroes is he and his followers were diehard dedicated to. They had a diehard dedication to Aristotle's physics, and they went so far as to say that if an observation contradicts Aristotle's physics, then Aristotle's reasoning is correct and the observation is somehow must be flawed. Okay. Now the problem with that point of view, and really the problem with the Muslim and the Greek point of view, is that sometimes your philosophical reasoning, like that reasoning with Aristotle with the pushers and the friction and all that, sometimes your philosophical reasoning can be flawed. Okay? So, I'll give you an example. I myself am an inventor. And what I've learned is that 99% of the ideas you think up in your head, once you draw them on paper, you realize that they're stupid. And then 99% of the ideas that make it through that stage to, and actually look good on paper, you build them. And then you find out that they're stupid. And then 99% of the ideas that you build and find, that 1% that you build it and and it's not stupid immediately will become stupid eventually. So, in other words, you can make errors in your reasoning, in your logical, philosophical reasoning. You can make mistakes. And observation is really good at pointing a finger at the error in the way you're thinking. So that, what seemed to make sense to you actually is way off, and you've got to, allow the observation to correct you and say, whatever, I'm making a mistake somewhere, I have to come up with a new theory. That attitude of embracing counterintuitive theories because observations defeated the earlier intuitive theory doesn't exist until Christianity comes along and you start having Christian guys argue for it in the 1200s. Now, before this, you've got examples that they like to prop up of like Ibn al-Haytham is probably the main one they like to prop up. But this guy, he did the scientific method. He used it. Yes, but he didn't defend the scientific method. He didn't argue for it. He just used it. And given that in his culture there's no evidence that anyone ever defended it, and that, they would use it from time to time begrudgingly and ashamedly when they couldn't think of any philosophical reasoning, exactly like the Greeks who came before them, then the only... Really, what you have with Muslim civilization are a continuation of Greek progress, but it kind of stalls out the same way that Greek ideas. It runs in the same sort of barrier that Greek ideas had, and again, they never got past the rocks thing, And Christians had trouble getting past the rocks thing too, but and eventually, this Al-Ghazali guy just comes in and he's anti-science. Now, in the Middle Ages, a lot of people would argue that, the Chinese were really, the guys. The Chinese were, the real scientists. Not exactly. It's a little more complicated than that. The Chinese really had religious objections to science, and so what you had is a sort of sad story of brilliant people coming along every so often, doing incredible things. And were they scientists? Did they have the idea of science? We'll never know, because the culture overall did not support them. And so it's not just important that somebody creates something, it's also important that the culture supports and basically contributes to the flourishing of that new idea. And in the Chinese world, you had religious objections to science that anytime someone made some sort of progress, it would hold it back. And so you had a lot of people who created a lot of cool inventions and cool new technologies and really brilliant breakthroughs that then the Chinese, hold back. So the problem was really their religious beliefs, the religious beliefs of the intellectuals and the elite. The common people stayed basically in polytheistic paganism, and they're largely still there to this day, even after communism. But the wealthy elite embraced this atheistic religion of the Tao, and then Confucianism is sort of a moral system built onto that, or else they were Buddhist, which was atheistic. So atheistic religions were there's some sort of something, an impersonal essence behind everything, but is explicitly not a personal being. So it's it's supernatural, it's sort of magical, powerful, but it's not personal. It's just sort of an impersonal, transcendent supernatural force Like in Star Wars, the Force, but the Force has no desires, doesn't care. You know, it's impersonal, but it's the transcendent supernatural force behind everything, the sort of impersonal essence. And so the problem is that, like in China, the idea of science, it's not that they rejected it like in the Greek world. It's that the idea would never even occur to them when they were so dedicated to, you know, their belief in the Tao. So, like, in their view, it would be a joke to think that we could possibly, with our mere human minds and mere human words, describe or understand how the world works. It would have to be radically beyond our comprehension. Okay? So, that really brings into light the contrast with what was going on in the Christian world at the same time. In the Christian world, they were creating these things called universities. It means like, you know, it's like unity of the many, you know, of the many verses or whatever. But like, I don't remember exactly what it means. But something like that. You basically bringing together different schools of thought, and they were always schools of higher learning. They were trying to go beyond what people knew in the past. Whereas in China, they had their great academies and great schools, but they were never like trying to go beyond. You know, they were like, you know, we don't want to get away from the old way. China also had this sort of, the traditional is better, progress is bad, because you're just getting into more error. I mean, they had that problem too. But they also, it was just sort of this thing that, like, we can't possibly comprehend the Tao. Whereas in the Christian world, God is the creator of everything. God is a personal being. Therefore, we should have a worshipful respect for God that leads us to think that, like, we should be in awe of God's blueprint for how the world works, which is essentially what laws of science are. But Christians developed this idea of scientific law in the medieval monasteries and eventually universities. Of scientific law, of law in nature, that, like, there's sort of a comprehensible plan or blueprint, because they believed that there was a being behind it all. Okay? And they further argued that observation in the 11 and 1200s, and the big name in this is Roger Bacon, not to be confused with Francis Bacon, who also argued for this, but centuries later, that science can be possible and that we should use observation. And again, it just really boiled down to this tremendous faith that what they were doing was just and holy and good. And that's basically the fact of the matter, is that they didn't have this disdain for the nitty-gritty of real life. The Greeks did. You know, the Greeks thought that to work with your hands meant that you were some kind of low-class fool. You know, and there was that too. And the Christians didn't have that. They thought that working with your hands was something that was like, it was like a medicine for the soul. You know, so anyway, that's how that happened. The debate raged on and continued in Christian circles, and they didn't call it the scientific method because it was all science. But what you had is you had the deductive method, which was Aristotle's way, and you had the experimental method, which is where you would correct your deductions with observation and experiment. So that's what Roger Bacon argued for. Correct, and they, throughout the Middle Ages, this wing made progress. So, like, they developed the concept. They made all sorts of giant leaps forward in science that eventually led to Copernicus's big breakthrough of the Earth revolves around the sun. And then when Copernicus made that big breakthrough of the Earth revolving around the sun, he actually built on numerous scientific advances that came before him. So, like, Roger Bacon argues for the experimental method, and then when it comes to the question of, like, the Earth revolving around the sun, there were various scientific objections to that idea that were overcome that then allowed for Copernicus to suggest it. So, like, Copernicus, I think, around 1600. So you got Roger Bacon to Copernicus. That's 400 years of scientific progress. So, like, one of the major objections was that the Earth couldn't possibly be moving. It doesn't appear to be moving, and so let's see. They developed in the Middle Ages. Different scientists on the experimental side developed the concept of impetus, what we would call momentum, that an object that is in motion tends to stay in motion. And so, in other words, they thought that if the Earth was moving, we would feel a constant wind of air going by us. And so, why does it feel like, if the Earth is moving, why don't we feel like we're moving? And so, the idea of impetus that was argued for, especially William of Ockham and some of these other guys, was that the impetus, so, like, for example, if you were to shoot an arrow up in the air, why doesn't the arrow fall behind you? Because the Earth is moving. Well, they would say the impetus or the momentum of the arrow that it already had before you shot it, relative to you, it doesn't look like, it doesn't feel like you're moving. So for example, if you're riding in a car and you throw an apple up in the air and then catch it, it falls back down on your hand as though you were just sitting still, when in reality you and the apple may be moving 55 miles an hour. But since you both had that original momentum, that's irrelevant to the fact that you threw it up. That idea was developed, and it was a major breakthrough that allowed the idea of the Earth revolving around the sun to be suggested. And there were a bunch of other things that were part of that breakthrough. So that breakthrough comes along, and what happened was the pro-experimental side of science shattered. It just kept making breakthroughs, and when it got to the point where it was like, no, the Earth does revolve around the sun, and then Galileo argues for it more forcefully, it was like the pro-experimental side just won the day. And so then you have some people on the pro-deductive side argued against the pro-experimental side on the basis of their interpretation of the Bible. Like Bible verses that might say the Earth does not move. Okay? And then you go over here and you've got other people on the experimental side. They were all Christians too. And they argued for different interpretations of the Bible and continued to defend their pro-experimental side. Okay? And the pro-experimental people prevailed. Alright? Basically in the 1500s and 1600s. Oh yeah. I don't know why I say Copernicus didn't live in the... Copernicus is like around 1500. But anyway, then in the 1700s, you had some atheist philosophers / historians who came in and said that when the pro-experimental Christians defeated the pro-deductive Christians, that was really the defeat of Christianity. And they redefined what had happened as this Christian idea of law in nature and being willing to trust your observations and use observations to correct your reason. And even in the 1500s, you've got not Roger Bacon, but Francis Bacon. He argued that based on Genesis, God intended for us to manage the world. Therefore, we should be able to do experimental science because God wouldn't make it so difficult for us to understand how the world works, and we can just trust our observations and correct our incorrect theories, and that sort of thing. So the Christians developed this idea of this holy mission, this like, it was an act of worship to find God's blueprint, and you're observing God's creation. This is God's holy creation that we're looking at here. It's not some sort of imperfect representation of what's in the mind. God created the universe, not some atheistic impersonal force that's too complicated to understand. God created the universe, and He created it for us. Okay, that idea, and for us to manage, that idea led to the experimental method. Okay, so then in the 1700s, you have these atheist guys like, Voltaire and the other philosophes, who like Edward Gibbon and Denis Diderot and those guys. I can't think of that Scottish guy, David Hume. They came along and they redefined what had happened, and they just made up some false claims about history too, just big ones. But their claims about science were big ones. What really happened was there was a Christian movement where a certain branch of Christianity won out the day, and then a great scientific revolution happened that eventually led to the curing of lots of diseases, which is really my point I was making. But these philosophers wanted to claim that like science was born out of a dark age, of an anti-scientific dark age, and that science was only born as people let go of religion, which is not actually correct. It was really just a different branch of Christianity that had roots in biblical doctrine and in the idea of a creator God. It was a very religious movement. And but they defined it as science was born in this sort of overnight miracle, when in reality it was a long, slow, hard, argued process. In the Middle Ages, and like the experimental method, the ideas of impetus, Copernican revolution, and then further arguments from Galileo, Kepler, these guys, Francis Bacon, like that's what happened. Okay, and then that led to the curing of lots of diseases. And so, from an ancient Jewish standpoint, think about the overall story here. In their view, back in the days of Noah, evil spirits corrupted the earth and brought all sorts of bad things to the world, including many of our diseases. Those diseases can go viral and have a life of their own. Sometimes demons want to get personally involved in someone's life. Jesus comes and makes it clear that He's curing lots of diseases, which means He's undoing the work of these evil spirits. And then the religion that He founds is the culmination of what He promised would happen. Because all sorts of diseases get cured through science. That's my point. 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 The curing of diseases through science is part of Jesus's attack on demonic control of this world. And it's not a contradiction of scientific law to say so. But anyway, that's my point. Thank you for your time. Hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day. Alright, now that we've gotten the general point out of the way, let's take a look at the details. Yes, now for the details of this, because there's probably people out there who are saying, no, the Muslims created science, Ibn al-Haytham created science, or the Greeks created science, or the Chinese created science, or something like that. That's probably what's most controversial. But there may be some people out there who really think that the lawnmower could run on water. And so I thought I might go in a little bit more detail about that. So let's just say it real simply. You may be saying to me that, if the lawnmower is running, then it has to be turning fast enough to turn the alternator, which is essentially an electrical generator. It's a different type of electrical generator. And that turning will charge the battery. You're half right. It does supply electrical energy into the battery, but the problem is that the electrical separation of hydrogen from oxygen in water will take more energy out of the battery than the alternator can put in when the engine is running at full throttle. So that should hopefully resolve that, just in case somebody out there. Anyway, hopefully no one thinks that the lawnmower could run on water. But the issue that probably a lot of people are, struggling with is like this whole thing of, Greeks created science, Muslims created science, yada, yada. So the difficult thing to understand here is that what we fail to realize about Christian medieval Europe and its contributions to the world is that it's not so much the invention of the thing that mattered in many cases as much as the recognition of the value of the thing. So, specifically, we can go to China for some examples here. In China, around 1000 AD, they invented the first printing press, which didn't come to Europe until the 1400s. The Gutenberg printing press that came out of Europe in the 1400s is considered the most important invention ever. Okay. The Chinese had it 400 years earlier, I think closer to 500 years earlier. Why didn't they have the most important invention ever? Because they only used it for cooking recipes and poetry. They didn't use it for science. They didn't use it to debate theology or philosophy or for the news. Okay, so they didn't recognize what they had. That's really sad. So that's just an example of what I'm talking about, We'll talk about more about them later, but when it comes to the scientific method, the issue is like, okay, you come up with an idea and you try to test it logically to see if it makes sense. You can also just test it by like observing to see if your idea works. So for example, Aristotle with the two rocks, why didn't he go out there and just observe that the two rocks hit the ground at the same time? Well, because he had all of this logical reasoning that said, that no, the heavy rock falls twice as fast. So, who knows what explanations they came up with to get around it, but they never questioned that. That was the rule of Aristotelian physics, and there was no greater physics until you get to really the invention of modern science, the modern scientific method. So on the one hand, Aristotle and the Greek ideas are kind of correct, but on the other hand, they're incorrect. And the issue was not that they had never had the idea. They had the idea to hey, build the thing to see if your idea is right. It's just like any inventor, or engineer. You have an idea on paper that hey, this is going to work. You have to build the thing, because you may make a mistake in your mind. But the problem was they thought Aristotle's reasoning about the rocks was so airtight that they're not going to test it with an observation. And they knew how to test things with observation. So Archimedes is a famous Greek scientist and philosopher who he famously is the one who said Eureka when he discovered the principle of displacement, when he had an odd-shaped object and he needed to measure the volume of the object, and he realized that he could put it in water, and then the amount of water that would be displaced would be equivalent to the volume of the object. And so he said Eureka. So anyway, you in Greek means good, and Rika, I have no idea what that means, but it means Rika. So I'm sure there's somebody out there who knows. Archimedes, for example, there was some geometry that he couldn't figure out one time, and we have his written record that he couldn't figure out just thinking in his mind, just using pure reasoning. So he had to build a physical model to help him figure out it was some geometry, to help him figure out some geometry. And, he expressed in his written works his personal shame about having to do that. That he was ashamed, you know. And on the one hand, the Greek initial step in science, actually, they took sort of the first leap, and like it really pushed things forward, but it stalled out. It kind of hit a roadblock, and it took the medieval Christians to push through that barrier. And it was a theological argument for them. You know, so here's an example of how it was a good thing. Generally speaking, Greek science came up with the idea of like coming up with general theoretical explanations for how the world works. And that was really cool, because then it would be like, okay, I have an idea that makes sense on paper. I'm going to start using that idea in the real world. And there's a lot of benefit that comes from that. So, for example, when you're digging back then, in any pre-modern time, you're digging with like a shovel and a pick. The pick will break up the hard dirt and the shovel will dig. And there was one Greek city that had to dig an escape tunnel like through a mountain because of like an invading army. And they couldn't dig, you can't really dig any faster than two guys can dig. Because if you have more guys, you can really just make a wider tunnel. You can't go further, you can't make the tunnel longer any faster. So, using their deductive logical reasoning, they deduced that like, okay, if you measure this angle here and sight out to here, go around here to here to here to here, you can dig right here at this angle. And they measured it all out, sighted it all out, you know, squares, and like surveyed it basically from the other side of the mountain. Then you can dig the tunnel twice as fast. And they actually did it. And you know, I saw a video of like where they did it. Like they were only off by like a few feet, you know. There was really a great scientific leap forward, but it stalled out, you know, because of its problem, because of its inherent problems. They had other problems too. The Greeks thought that time was cyclical, so like they thought that they all the Greek philosophical schools were dedicated to cyclical time. So like they thought that they were living at like the peak of progress, and so they embraced their progress and they progressed to the point they were at, but they thought they were literally at the golden age, and there would be, you know, after them it would all be downhill, and they thought everything that they had created had been created in the past. They just, you know, there had been a dark age. It's kind of sort of the reverse of the Chinese, who felt like their golden age was in the past, and that you know, any deviation from the past was getting further into error. So anyway, with the Muslims, and with specifically Ibn al-Haytham, he's important in the creation of science, not because he created the scientific method, because really he didn't do anything outside of the Greek box. You know, he used the scientific method in what would become his most important work, which is his work on the study of light, or optics. And he actually used the scientific method there, but again, it's like, well, the Greeks knew to use it too. Now, Ibn al-Haytham never defended the scientific method as a good thing. He also never expressed shame about it. He just didn't go on record, you know, about that stuff. But it's important to note that, like, it's only natural to assume that he thought what everyone else thought in his day, like during the Muslim Golden Age, that he was stuck in Greek ideas. And a powerful piece of evidence for this is that he went on to do a lot of scientific work on the moon and published on it after his work on optics. And he didn't use the scientific method one bit. You know, every chance he had, he just used Greek deductive reasoning, you know, everywhere he could. So, you know, he never said whether or not the scientific method was a good thing or a bad thing. He basically just followed the Greek standard of, like, he used it sparingly, but, you know, when he also didn't use it. That's no different from Archimedes, you know. He just didn't go on record talking about how he was ashamed, you know. So anyway, but it's interesting because when you get to 200 years later in medieval Europe in the 1200s, you've got Roger Bacon there, who, like, he defended the scientific method. And there was a burgeoning, or they called it the Baconian method, the experimental method, you know. It wasn't just him by himself. There were other guys who came before him in the century before him, and right around his time, it was a new movement. He was more like the spokesperson for the movement, and it was a movement that, generally speaking, the medieval Christian world was still stuck in that Greek deductive reasoning, logical reasoning only. Never test your ideas with observation mold. And Bacon kind of became the spokesperson for the experimental method, and he wouldn't publish. The Pope ordered him to write for the Pope. And so then he went ahead and, in a year of frenzied work, he wrote his Opus Majus, which was essentially a major defense of the scientific method. And what he did is he actually was aware of the work of Ibn al-Haytham. And he explicitly looked at what Ibn al-Haytham did in using the scientific method to study optics, and he said, we should be doing that all the time. And he said, everything Aristotle said should be tested with this method. So Ibn al-Haytham was stuck in that old mold of okay, use Aristotelian deductive reasoning whenever possible, but if you can't, then you gotta use the worst method of observational science, or what's called inductive reasoning, okay, versus deductive. And so Roger Bacon looks at it and he's like, no, but he wasn't he was the guy who published on it at a time when this was a small burgeoning movement. But there were a handful of guys across medieval Europe in these universities, and people who had been in the generation before him of his professors. Famously Robert Grosseteste was one who had written on this before too. But Roger Bacon was the big guy who really came in there, and he just overthrew everything, and he was like, everything Aristotle said should be tested. One of his famous examples, observationally, was Aristotle said that cold water freezes slower than hot water. You heard me right. That the hot water will freeze quicker in the cold than the cold water. And so Roger Bacon said, we shouldn't consult Aristotle on this. All we have to do is take some hot water and some cold water and put them outside on a snowy day and see which one freezes first. And it's interesting because Ibn al-Haytham clearly recognized that the repeatability of his experiments demonstrated the strength of his findings, and yet he still was stuck in that Greek mold. It wasn't until you get to these Christian guys who really just said, no, we've got to run with this experimental method thing. And their defenses of it were it wasn't without Christian backing. You know what I mean? This is a theological movement. So one of the interesting things is Roger Bacon, in his defense of modern science, he used the the biblical sin of idolatry. And he said that our being stuck in deductive science is a form of mental idolatry. That we're essentially just uplifting our own ideas beyond what you see directly with your eyes. And so there was this Christian idea that God has created this world for us, and it's just all throughout, It's been summed up in this way. I think it was Rodney Stark or Alfred North Whitehead who said that the medieval mind in medieval Christians had an idea of that there was a secret to be unveiled, and there was also a long running Christian tradition of seeing science, especially deductive science, and then eventually inductive science, scientific method science, as what they called the tradition of the handmaiden of theology. In other words, they thought that like they could use these things to help them better interpret the Bible, for like biblical interpretation. So anyway, before I move on, talk about some other stuff, it's important to say that like Aristotle and those deductive science guys weren't totally wrong. There are situations where your mental reasoning is so airtight that like if the observation doesn't fit, you're going to have to say there's something wrong with the observation. So for example, this is my simple example I think everyone can understand. Let's say you want to do an experiment, and so you take a box, a small shoebox or something, and you put 3 gold watches in the shoebox. And you put the lid on it, and then you take the shoebox and you put it in the attic. And you wait 1 year, and then you return to the attic, and you open the box and you find 4 gold watches in the box. Okay. What would you conclude? Well, you would conclude that like maybe you forgot how many watches you put in the box. Did you keep good records, Or you would just conclude, you probably conclude that somebody put another, messing with you and put another gold watch in the box. Did you take photographic evidence? You maybe need to do the experiment again. Okay. What you would never, ever, ever, ever conclude, because it's logically, deductively silly, it's deductively just proven to never be true. You would never conclude that the number 3 equals the number 4. You would be willing to accept any outrageous theory before you'd accept that. So like, you'd say that like maybe watches can reproduce like insects or baboons, or maybe it has something to do with like quantum entanglement in physics, or something like this. You would never, never conclude that number 3 equals number 4. So in that situation, 3 does not equal 4 is airtight logical reasoning. But nonetheless, you can get a little too arrogant in your logical reasoning. And that's where Roger Bacon's coming from. And he's saying it's a form of idolatry. He called it mental idolatry. It was really fascinating. He had like different kinds of... He actually broke it down into like 4 different kinds of mental idolatry. And this thing with Aristotle and the rocks, he sees that as a form of mental idolatry. Where it's like, dude, your reasoning isn't as great as you think it is. You need to rethink this. You need to let the observation cause you to question your deductive reasoning. Okay? It's not that deductive reasoning is always a bad thing. You can get a little too down on it, but I hate to break it to you, but the number 3 really doesn't equal the number 4. But anyway, I think the point's been made. So anyway, some more other interesting things that Roger Bacon advocated. He advocated that anyone who's a pure theologian should also study science too, because it would be good for them. And he also advocated that theologians don't simply argue about philosophical concepts about God, purely, logically reasoning about God, but they should also study the Bible itself in the original languages and get back to like what the Bible said. So so in other words, he wanted to put more empiricism, in a sense, even into theology. So anyway, let's get back to China. So like we said with China, the problem was you had all these brilliant people, but you didn't have the support, and you even had an anti-scientific atheistic religious worldview. And just some famous examples of that. They for example, they had the printing press 400 or closer to 500 years before Europe, and they never used it for anything but cooking recipes and poetry. And you think, well, they didn't even have universities. Whereas in medieval Europe at the same time, around 1000 AD, They had the first universities, and all instruction at all the universities was in Latin, so that professors could go from university to university. Invitations to join faculty at a different university was usually because you had been able to go beyond the old knowledge, whereas the Chinese wanted to stay close to the old knowledge. Another problem for the Chinese is their alphabet wasn't as good, so the development of a phonetic alphabet with a short list of characters was something that goes back to the Bronze Age, the Phoenicians, etc., etc. And certainly in medieval Europe, they had the Roman alphabet like what we use in modern English today. And that makes the printing press a lot easier to use. Whereas in China, you had like 1,000 characters. Nonetheless, the intellectual elite who knew how to write should have been using the printing press. It's somewhat of an excuse, but not enough to get them off the hook. Another example is they clearly invented gunpowder. Roger Bacon, famously in his Opus Magus, is the first to ever write down a formula for gunpowder. But we know that the Chinese had gunpowder well before that. So what happened when the Portuguese were the first to sail around the tip of Africa in the 1400s? Vasco da Gama comes back to Portugal, small European country, and he says, hey, we could take over all trade on the Indian Ocean with I think he said something like 15 extra ships. And they did. Why? Because the Chinese, who had controlled it along with Muslims also, the Chinese didn't have any guns, didn't have any cannons. They invented gunpowder, but they didn't have any guns. So that's just sad. But that illustrates this point that I'm talking about. Is invention of something isn't always the whole thing. You have to recognize the value of the thing. So when gunpowder came to Europe, in the 1400s, it immediately changed things. So it was instant. And this is, a good example of how political division and constant war can help progress, whereas a huge unifying government and stability and peace can hold back progress. The Chinese tended to resist change because they saw that could introduce anarchy, whereas in Europe, no one could prevent the anarchy and different kings and monarchs and nobles going to war. And so, for example, in 1600, the gun first came to Japan, and the emperor said, "Oh, we'll go back into civil war if a peasant can now kill a highly skilled samurai. So I'm just going to ban guns from my country as some kind of horrible thing." And they succeeded for a while. Well, in China, they didn't. Even though they created gunpowder, they didn't really ban gunpowder, but they did. The government did maintain stability, and the Europeans weren't able to invade and take over China, but they took over all trade on the high seas easily. Because the Chinese didn't have cannons. Okay. They preferred to use gunpowder for fireworks, which were for purposes of magic. Not only that, it's very possible, it's not entirely certain, but it's very possible that the Chinese invented the compass. But they didn't invent the compass card. In other words, the little thingy that goes under the compass that tells you what degree you're pointing. They just had a thingy that pointed north. They didn't know what degree off of north. In other words, they didn't use the compass for navigation on the high seas. They didn't recognize the value of this thing. Again, they used it for magic. Yes, you heard me right. For magic. They use it for magic. Okay, so, again, you have brilliant people who come along, create incredible things, but there's a society that holds them back. And one of the famous examples is in the early 1400s. I can't remember the name of. There was a brilliant, big shot Chinese guy. He figured out he was figuring out how to traverse the seas, really. He was going and making trips to Africa. And he probably would have sailed around Africa before the Europeans. Now, getting all the way up to Europe was another story, because that was the really difficult part, getting not really getting down to the tip of Africa for Portugal. It was really like getting around sort of the Horn of Africa. That was the difficult part for them because there's just so much desert and you have to stay really far off the coast to make it. But anyway, he brought back like all kinds of exotic African animals to the Chinese emperor's palace. But as soon as he died, you know what they did? This is the famous story. They ordered that all of his ships that could traverse the high seas be destroyed, and that the only types of ships that people are allowed to have are what's called junks, which are vessels that stay near the coast. Okay, and no one can go on these long trips and come back. They ordered that all plans for these type of ships be destroyed. And they ordered that all of the African animals that he brought back to the zoo be killed because they can't have outside influences. And they were very advanced. They were really, they had a lot of cool things. Going back to 1000 AD, they developed the world's first restaurant culture. They had a lot of cool things that they developed, but they never developed science. And it was really part of their atheistic religion that, they just couldn't embrace the idea. Okay? Now, all that said, I think there's only one thing left for us to cover, and it's the question of the idea that atheism created science, right? That science was only born as Christianity eroded away, and that was what allowed the first secular nation to exist, and that's where science comes from. Now, there's so many problems with this view. This was a very popular view for a very long time, and it was largely based on lies of atheists in the 1700s who then became respected thinkers and thought leaders in the French Revolution, the philosophes. But, eventually people started to see problems in this. This view that religion is in conflict with science, and science can only flourish when religion goes away, is called the conflict thesis. That's the official name. It's called the conflict thesis. The conflict thesis is the consensus of historians of science, the experts who study these things. The consensus is that the conflict thesis is wrong. It is incorrect. It is not true. The conflict thesis is wrong. That is not a controversial view anymore. It might have been 100 years ago. It might have been in the 1940s, maybe in the 1950s. But it's gone. It's long gone. Okay, so, one of the issues for them, they looked at China and they said, they were more advanced technologically. They had all these brilliant breakthroughs. And their religions were more atheistic. Why aren't they ahead of Europe? Something's not stirring the Kool-Aid on this conflict thesis. This is a problem for the conflict thesis. Part of the problem with the conflict thesis is it requires you to believe in a very much overnight miracle. Science wasn't created like Jesus came down and created it. Atheistic Jesus came down and created it. No. It took forever. It was long, slow process. There were two groups within the Christian universities, and slowly but surely, the empirical science, the scientific method side built steam, and they really got a foothold there with Roger Bacon. And then by the 1600s, they prevailed. Okay. You have, sometimes popular level atheists will say things. So you have your intellectual atheists who are don't say really dumb things. And you have your sort of pop atheists who say really dumb things a lot. Richard Dawkins is, he's not a dumb man, but when it comes to his criticisms of religion and, his proposals, his propping up in support of his defenses of atheism, he says really dumb things. And he just does. That's just bottom line. And one of those things is he always suggests, I've listened to his audiobook, which is basically a long lecture from him. In it, he suggests that even Isaac Newton was an atheist. So he suggests that these Christian thinkers who pushed the scientific method forward were closeted atheists. You know, this is a conspiracy theory par excellence. You know, you've got guys defending, like Francis Bacon and Roger Bacon and these other guys, defending the scientific method, making biblical arguments for it. And then you got people like Richard Dawkins saying, oh, they had to do that because of the oppression. Oh, yeah. Really? You know, and he even goes so far as to suggest Isaac Newton, you know, was a closeted atheist. I was like, really? 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 You know, we seem to be making up things that we have no evidence for to keep our conflict thesis alive. Okay, and the burden of proof is on you. You know? So, let me make sure. Let's go take a look at this list. Alright. I think we've covered everything on the list. There's one more thing about... I have on my notes here something about demons. And, I don't know what I was saying about demons. Oh, I remember. It's a bit difficult to explain, but essentially, the way things work with, you know, demonic influence, demons don't have to exist supernaturally. They could be part of our natural world, but on some sort of plane of existence, or, you know, in other words, it's possible that there's things we don't understand about our physical universe, and on that level, demons exist. In other words, demons they're not God, and God is the creator of the universe. So God has to exist beyond all of, you know, in other words, like, here's a way to put it. I saw a debate one time where there was an atheist professor and a Christian professor, and the atheist said that, well, the Christian said that, you know, the universe hasn't always existed. What created the universe? You know, I won't go into the details of how they got to that point in the debate, but, like, you know, he was proposing that God created the universe, and the atheist said he accepted that the universe hasn't always existed, but what could exist beyond the natural universe, if we look beyond that, could be more natural universe. And the Christian was like, well, that's a contradiction in terms. Nature can't create itself. So either nature is uncreated and eternal, or time doesn't exist, but it can't create itself, you know. And so if it's true that the natural world did come into existence, then it either came into existence for no reason at all, or something created it. So, the point being, when it comes to God, you've got to have some sort of transcendent foundational basis upon which everything else relies. Those requirements don't really apply to demons. They could be some sort of parallel universe beings or something, you know, like, there's all kinds of possibilities in quantum physics for them to exist in ways that we can't yet understand, but still be part of our natural universe. You know, they don't have to be the creator of it. So they don't even have to be, you know, as C.S. Lewis put it, supernatural. They could just be, you know, what's called preternatural. You know, that they just have abilities that go beyond ours. So anyway, that sums it up. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for your time.